Here we are with, now, most of us aren't really all that worried about infectious diseases. Well, we weren't until recently, and then we got our comeuppance. But these were basically one of the strongest selective factors on humans, or on any other living thing for that matter, are microbes, pathogens, whether they're viruses or bacteria, fungi, archaea, whatever it is, that can cause infection. Now, as we're going to learn, most bacteria that we have are not harmful, partly because of our immune system. And we've got actually more bacterial cells living in us and on us than real cells of our own body. Okay. But in the past, there have been epidemics that were absolutely devastating, that had huge historical consequences. And the most well-known one, since we're from, basically, a lot of us are from Western Europe, we don't learn all that much about African history or about the Far Eastern history, Chinese and things like that. But it turns out they had epidemics like this too. This one came along in, let's see, it was the mid-14th century, 1350 or something. Supposedly it came on a boat that went through the Black Sea, where it had been carried overland along the Silk Route. So this is during the Middle Ages. When it got into Europe, it basically killed, I don't know, maybe half of all the population, maybe more. And at that time, late medieval Europe was feudal. It was a feudal state. So you had all these kings and then princes and all that. They had land holdings, and the people that lived on the land were basically part of the land. They owned the land. They owned the people. And they got cheap labor, right? So the people they grew all the food, and they had to give a certain amount to their overlord, who then also had to give a certain amount to the overlord, like the king. Well, that changed everything because suddenly labor wasn't cheap anymore. And it was this is probably the thing that started what's called the Italian Renaissance. Anybody heard about that? Well, history. Has anybody taken history? History? No. Maybe some. Have you heard about the Italian Renaissance? Okay, what was it?
What do you mean, what was it? Was it one of their time periods where they had a lot of painters and all that come up, and it was a really good economic time period for them.
And really creative, and not just in painting, but the beginnings of science. Galileo came a little bit later, late Renaissance. But anyway, the Italian Renaissance then spread throughout Europe, and the old feudal estates were gone because people suddenly their working worth was more than just being part of the land, and trade guilds were set up, for different kinds of arts and crafts and things like that, and it completely changed Europe. Before that, during the medieval period, people did not believe that change was possible. Okay? They thought God had made everything, and that for the most part, you were born, let's say, as a serf, and you're going to stay a serf your whole life. And if you were born into the aristocracy, your children were going to go on that way. And this was because God set it up. There's God on the top, and human society was set up the same way. Well, this kind of put a stick into the idea that, of course, there was no change. It changed everything. So they know exactly what the plague was now. It was the same bubonic plague that we have today, except that, first of all, it's a bacteria, so it's curable. Now, there's some other things going on. Normally, it's a vector-borne disease, which we're going to learn about, where usually an insect carries a bacterium and then bites the human, carries a bacterium or a virus or whatever, bites the human, transmits the disease, like malaria. Okay? Malaria, of course, is not a bacteria, it's a eukaryotic parasite. So you can kind of take a look at how it spread. So let's see, December 1347 was the whole Bosporus between Turkey and then basically, Carpathian Mountains, but it's part of Yugoslavia there. It's Constantinople and Greece. From there, it went to, let's see, June 13, it went across the Carpathian Mountains, all across Europe. And then, let's see, after that, December, okay, that was that. Okay, I got it. Yeah. So it went up and down the Italian coast and into Europe, then across the Carpathian Mountains, then across kind of Upper Europe, Zurich, Strasbourg, Germany, the Netherlands, went through London, then into Germany, and it's kind of spread all through there. So you can see how it spread in waves. And there were some areas that were completely spared, but there were whole villages wiped out. Kind of like, remember, it wasn't very long ago when we had Ebola virus in West Africa. Killed, I don't know, it didn't kill all that, it killed 11,000 people, which is a lot. But whole villages were completely wiped out. And it would have been worse, except that it turns out Ebola is kind of hard to spread. You need actual contact with bodily fluids. So you can't really spread it through the air and things like that. Now, this vector-borne diseases, if there's a good vector, like for malaria, it can spread to a large part of the population. And it was thought that it spread through fleas, but there were also instances where it looked like it turned into pneumonic plague, where it was actually spread through the air like the flu. And so Europe was completely changed. I mean, they've gone through to this area up here, in an area called Smithfield, England, where they went into old graves of plague victims and recovered bubonic plague bacteria, and then put it into a phylogeny to see exactly how it fit with today's plague. And there was also another plague called the Justinian plague in, I think, the 6th century AD. This is kind of the end of the Roman Empire. And they recovered plague from that too. So it's obviously been, it was circulating and reoccurring over, hundreds of years. Okay, so this is I think this is Hieronymus Bosch, who's a Flemish painter. And he was very religious. And the Black Death, of course, had a huge effect on people. And they thought it was God's retribution for being evil. They also went after the Jews, of course, any kind of scapegoat. But it didn't matter who you were going to die, for the most part. No, that was Bruegel, sorry. And then there's the Justinian plague. And then there's this, a look at the phylogeny of the different kinds. So there was a pandemic in the 19th and 20th centuries. It didn't get very big, but it did a fair amount in China and East Asia. And then actually there were, I think people got it in San Francisco, and a number of other places, but it didn't spread like the other ones did. We can actually look at, this is where the first pandemic shows up in terms of the phylogeny. So we have this base phylogeny of Yersinia pestis, and we've collected all these different variants of it. And then the second pandemic shows up here. And then the third pandemic is this, and I'm not sure what the variant looks like now, but it looks like it might be something like this. I'm not sure. So anyway, these things have gone around and around, and there's always been plagues. They're kind of I saw a bubonic plague epidemic up in this valley in eastern Nevada, in western Nevada in the mountains, right across from Tahoe, that infected chipmunks and things like that. And it was staggering. I'm a field biologist, ecologist, and I was looking at seed dispersal with these animals, and all of a sudden, these animals were just dropping dead by the side of the road. And until, by the end, there were hardly any chipmunks or ground squirrels or anything like that left. They just it was like what was the avian flu, what was it called that came through here that wiped out all the birds? So it's kind of staggering how it kind of reformulates everything. And we still got, of course, problems nowadays with all these viral diseases. A lot of them are vector-driven, like Zika is a new one. Doesn't normally cause too much problem with adults, but with fetuses, it causes a lot of neurological destruction. Okay. Oh yeah, there was another thing. There was the one that went through in the 14th century. It kind of tended to recirculate throughout Europe for the next couple of hundred years. So there was a time when Newton was figuring things out where everybody left London because it was sweeping through there and it was killing like 7,000 or 8,000 people a week. It eventually killed at least half of all London. The king left, the whole government left, people just skedaddled, and it was killing everybody. So Newton went off by himself, and that's where he got the whole thing about the apple. And it was not that the apple hit him on the head, he was wondering, how come the apple didn't fly off in this direction or up or whatever, and that was the key to gravity. So anyway, there was a pandemic in 1918. It killed about 50 million people around the world. It was called the Spanish flu, mainly because where it showed up. It kind of was one of the things that brought a halt to World War I. At the end, it was one of the leading killers of all the soldiers. They were in barracks, and it spread very easily. And it was a very virulent form of flu. We think the flu, and we think it's you get pretty sick, high fever and all that. But this one worked more like a hemorrhagic fever. And so there was a lot of internal bleeding, all sorts of stuff. People, I talked to my grandma who lived through it, and people would wake up in the morning, they'd feel fine, by the end of the day they were dead. So they also sequenced that flu as well to find out exactly why that one turned into the killer flu that it did, whereas most flus don't. And they actually recovered it from some graves up in the Arctic with an Inuit village where people there got the flu too, and they put them in a common grave, and they recovered that flu, so they know what it looked like. It's thought that well, it turns out flu mutates a lot. So, in fact, that's why we have to have a new flu shot every year, because there's different strains of it floating around. The main reservoir are birds. And so what they try to do is they collect various strains, and then they make a vaccine from that so that it's more recent. But sometimes you miss out. So the year before last, they had a vaccine that was not very effective at all in terms of protecting people from the flu. And, you know, most people aren't going to die from the flu, but older people, infants, those sorts of situations are what kill flu victims today. So it carried alleles, gene variants, right? And these were usually proteins on the surface of the flu virus that it used to enter the cells of the body. And so if it changes all the time, you can see how the immune system will recognize one kind of strain that's come around before, and you don't have a problem with that, but it doesn't recognize a new strain. So, they've also been worried about, you know, another pandemic like the one before in 1918. They're always worried that a new bird strain will jump into another population of flu viruses, and somehow you get mutations that carry like the 1918 strain did. Okay, so a pathogen is just any disease-causing organism. Most microorganisms, as I said, are non-pathogenic. Either because, well, we never come across them, or they do a lot of stuff actually. I mean, they're the base of the food chain in a lot of sense for a lot of things. They break a lot of stuff down that otherwise wouldn't be broken down. So they do a lot of good things. But when a pathogen or a microbe, whether it's a bacteria or virus, a fungal disease, something like that, invades a host, it causes an infection. Now, it turns out a lot of pathogens that in the past would have caused infection are now not causing infection in us. So I'll give you a good example of one that's non-pathogenic in one species and pathogenic in another, is that's HIV. There's a correlate in monkeys, chimpanzees, and then actual monkeys in Africa. And the monkeys, they've got lots of virus floating around in their blood system, but they're not suffering any effects whatsoever. However, with us, of course, AIDS crossed into the human population probably from eating bushmeat that was tainted. And it does, of course, cause, HIV and AIDS. So when it does produce an infectious agent, it means that it's actually contagious. And contagious means that one is like from one individual to the next. Okay. Probably you guys don't remember this, but around the same time as 9/11, someone was sending anthrax to various senators and House of Representatives and whatever. And now anthrax, it turns out, is not a very dangerous pathogen. It doesn't spread readily. There's two forms, one that causes skin infection, the other that causes a lung infection that's usually fatal. So, in fact, it was used during a certain time. Anthrax was used as a bioweapon, so weaponized anthrax, where you turn these spores into kind of an aerosol. It was, of course, never used. People aren't doing that anymore. But it's not exactly really readily contagious between people. Usually livestock get it because you can find it in the soil in many places. Okay, now, they spread from person to person. So you can have a respiratory pathogen, like the flu or the cold, or measles. Measles is the same way. In fact, measles is probably one of the most contagious pathogens out there. You can also get it from contact with other items or exposure, let's say, to bodily fluids, so STDs. But also Ebola was all transmitted basically through bodily fluids. It was not through necessarily aerosols or anything like that. So most of the people who initially got Ebola, once it was in the population, they had a tradition of burying people where they washed the bodies, and those are the people that then got sick, and they passed it on to everybody else around them because they got sick, and whole villages were wiped out. So you can think that it's kind of a very effective way, but it's not compared to measles. I mean, measles, if someone with measles came in here, there's a 90% chance of anybody who didn't have the vaccine would get it. Yeah.
Did any Ebola spread here?
What?
Did any Ebola spread to the States?
Oh, no, so there were a few people who were brought here, and one person who was a doctor, went there to help people and came back and then developed symptoms here, and then they actually saved all of them, but they almost lost. There were a couple, there was a couple of early cases of a guy from Africa who made it here, and then he died in the New York, I think it was a New York hospital or something like that. So, I mean, there was a big to-do, like Ebola was the next plague. And obviously, fatality rates in excess of 50%, in some cases it's been like 90%. But it didn't actually carry. Like past Ebola epidemics were usually very localized. They were contained. It was usually the people who lived there and then the doctors who went and tried to save them who got it and died. And then it would kind of burn out. In West Africa, the population density was a lot higher, and there were many more people living in the area. And so it actually managed to go on for like a year, and then eventually subsided. So there's still cases there now. It turns out that it starts an immune response, so they're probably going to have a vaccine soon, but a lot of the people that actually survived Ebola are now not susceptible anymore. Okay. So, non-contagious pathogens spread by means other than person to person, whether it's contact or aerosols through the lung, things like that. So like salmonella, which is common salmonella, and then typhoid fever is another form of it. That's all food and waterborne. So you usually get it from that way. And then there's another, of course, and that's vector-borne disease, whether it's malaria, Lyme disease, which is kind of a spirochete bacteria. There's a lot of vector-borne diseases that are viral. It seems like ticks carry more transmit more vector-borne diseases than almost anything. In fact, there's new tick-spread diseases popping up all the time, where they've maybe found 1 or 2 cases before, and they suddenly realized later on that oh, it was another one. Let's see, there was tularemia is a virus that's spread by ticks, and among many. So, and vector-borne diseases are really effective because if you have a disease that puts people down so they can't get up and walk around and spread it, let's say, it's not going to spread very much. It's not like you're walking around with, a deadly disease like a deadly flu, which doesn't happen often, that is transmitted contagiously through the air. In fact, most diseases that are transmitted through the air, airborne diseases, tend not to be quite as virulent as diseases that are vector-borne. Because as long as the vector can keep moving between patient and patient, transmission happens whether the person who's infected is up and about or laying flat on his back, in delirium. So, virulence, or the ability to cause disease, is a heritable trait. In other words, how easily does it spread, and to what degree does it make the person sick? And here's a bunch of different ones. Of course, here's less chance of transmission from person to person. If you're really sick, you're on your deathbed. You're not moving around. Less virulent tends to be those that can be carried around. People can walk around with the disease without, they're not going to die or anything. Here's ticks. Now, there's also food and waterborne pathogens tend to be pretty virulent, like typhoid fever, cholera, hepatitis A. There's a whole bunch of them. And they spread readily through, let's say, unclean drinking water, things like that. In fact, cholera, there's always cholera epidemics going around some places. It's fairly easy to treat. People usually die of dehydration from it. But there was in I think the 1860s, in London, there was a case of typhoid fever, and a guy named, I think it was John Snow, this is before there was really a germ theory of disease. But he figured out that, in fact, there was this one well and pump that was transmitting a cluster of cholera from this one area. So most of the people who got sick were collecting water from there and not elsewhere. They eventually spread it to other pumps around the city, but he actually tracked it. And it was the first case of what's called epidemiology, looking at how diseases spread, how fast and quickly they spread. So cholera usually spreads very rapidly. If you have good sanitation, though, it usually stops it. But anyway, we can look at this right here. And in terms of on the bottom, deaths per infection. So if we actually look at, okay. So these things like this is influenza and stuff. Doesn't have very many, so directly transmitted. And then diseases like, let's see, like this, okay, and vector-borne, the vector-borne diseases tend to be a lot more virulent, some of which, upwards of 20%, 30%, something like that. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are eukaryotic pathogens, whether like malaria or worms. What was it? Oh God! Oops! Shit! Oh, good. Okay. Let's see. Schistosomiasis are these little worms, but they have a very kind of complicated life cycle, including single-cell organisms. And then, of course, bacteria, viruses, usually very small. Okay. Okay. So there's, like I said, worms, schistosomiasis causes, I think one of these causes river blindness, tapeworms, of course. If you want to lose weight, eat a tapeworm. Trichinosis, which we find in uncooked pork products or bears, things like that. Of course, nowadays the pork is pretty much free of all trichinosis. So basically things like giardia, which is causes kind of a dysentery disease, sleeping sickness and malaria, fungi. One of the opportunistic infections for AIDS, they get terrible cases of oral thrush, which is a fungal disease. And there are fungal diseases that are really serious, that are hard to treat. In fact, fungal diseases in a lot of respects are harder to treat than bacteria. We don't have very many good antifungal agents. Oh, I know what we have to do. Oops. Okay. You guys have to fill these out.